Have you ever wondered when international terrorism first began to shape our world? It's a question that takes us back to the 19th century, an era when the world was rapidly changing and new ideologies were taking shape. This period saw the birth of what we now recognize as international terrorism, a phenomenon that would grow to significantly shape global politics and society. The first sparks of international terrorism can be traced back to nationalist movements that emerged in various parts of the world. These groups, driven by a deep desire for independence, chose violence as a means to achieve their goals. They believed in the power of fear and disruption to bring about change. Take, for instance, the Irish Republican Army or the IRA. Their struggle for Irish independence from British rule was marked by a campaign of violence that spanned several decades. They targeted not only the forces of British authority, but also civilians, using bombings and assassinations to CR. The second half of the 20th century witnessed an alarming rise in international terrorism. As the world reeled from the aftermath of World War II, newly established political structures paved the way for the birth of extremist groups. Their goal? To overthrow governments and establish a new political order. This period was a crucible, a melting pot of ideologies and ambitions, all culminating in an explosion of international terrorism. Take, for instance, the Red Brigades in Italy. Born out of the tumultuous political climate of the 70s, this Marxist-Leninist group sought to create a revolutionary state. Their methods were brutal and unflinching, with kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations becoming their signature. Over in Palestine, the Black September organization emerged. Named after a conflict in September of 1970, they were a militant offshoot of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Their most infamous act was the Munich Massacre, where they took 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage, an event that ended in a tragic loss of life. Meanwhile, the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, continued their violent struggle for the independence of Northern Ireland from British rule. Their campaign of violence, which included bombings, shootings, and hunger strikes, lasted for nearly 3 decades, causing immense suffering and loss. Each of these groups, with their distinct ideologies and methods, contributed to the surge in international terrorism. Major terrorist attacks became frequent headlines, painting a grim picture of the world. Innocent lives were lost, families were torn apart, and fear gripped nations across the globe. This period marked a turning point, as international terrorism became a global concern. Governments and international organizations were forced to acknowledge and address this growing threat. This was not just about isolated incidents or regional conflicts anymore. Terrorism had crossed borders, and its impact was being felt worldwide. The fight against this global menace had just begun, and it was a fight that would shape the world in the years to come. The advent of the digital age brought with it a new wave of international terrorism. As we stepped into the twilight of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st, the world was evolving at a rapid pace. A revolution was unfolding, not one of weapons and warfare, but of technology and information. The digital age was upon us, and with it came the internet, a tool of immense power that would change the face of the world as we knew it. However, this tool of enlightenment and connection also cast a shadow, a dark underbelly that would become a breeding ground for a new breed of terrorism. The internet and other forms of digital communication provided a platform for extremist ideologies to spread like wildfire. No longer did these groups need to meet in secret or distribute physical propaganda. They could now reach millions at the click of a button, radicalizing individuals from the comfort of their own homes. This digital tool, created to bring the world closer, was now being used to tear it apart. Amidst this digital revolution, the world was shaken to its core by the events of September 11, 2001. Orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, these attacks were a horrifying demonstration of the power and reach of modern terrorist organizations. This marked a turning point in the history of international terrorism. The world stood still as it watched the Twin Towers crumble, a stark reminder of the destructive capabilities of these groups and the lengths they were willing to go to achieve their goals. Post-September 11, the war on terrorism took a new turn. Nations across the globe united in their efforts to combat this growing threat. Yet the nature of this new enemy was elusive. With the digital world as their playground, these groups were harder to track, their plans more intricate, and their attacks more devastating. The advent of the digital age had indeed brought a new wave of international terrorism. The world was now facing a new enemy, one that was more elusive and destructive than ever before. The 21st century saw the rise of some of the most brutal terrorist organizations the world has ever known. These groups, unlike their predecessors, have shown an unprecedented level of brutality and ruthlessness in their pursuit of power. They are motivated by a perverse interpretation of religious ideologies and are willing to commit unspeakable acts of violence to achieve their goals. One such group is the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. Emerging in the chaos of post-invasion Iraq, ISIS grew from an al-Qaeda offshoot into a pseudo-state spanning large parts of Iraq and Syria. They utilized the power vacuum left by the Iraq War, coupled with the Syrian civil war, to establish a reign of terror. Their acts of violence, broadcasted on social media for the world to see, were horrific. Beheadings, mass executions, and cultural genocide became their calling cards, all in the pursuit of establishing a so-called caliphate. Similarly, in Africa, Boko Haram emerged as a potent force of terror. Originating from Nigeria, this group unleashed a reign of terror across West Africa, abducting schoolgirls, bombing public spaces, and displacing millions. Their brutality, much like ISIS, is rooted in a distorted interpretation of Islam, with the aim of establishing a religious state ruled by strict Sharia law. What sets these groups apart is their willingness to commit extremely brutal acts of violence. They don't just seek political change, they strive to instill fear and assert dominance. Their brutality is not a byproduct of their cause, it is a tactic. They use it to intimidate, to coerce, and to make their presence known. These groups have also mastered the use of modern communication channels, using them to recruit, spread propaganda, and even coordinate attacks. The digital age has allowed them to spread their ideology and reach audiences they would have otherwise been unable to. These groups have redefined the face of international terrorism, making it a global threat. Their emergence underscores the evolving and complex nature of international terrorism, a challenge that continues to test the resolve of nations worldwide. The fight against international terrorism is far from straightforward. It's a complex and multifaceted battle that requires understanding the myriad factors, actors, and events that have shaped this historical narrative. One common misconception is that all forms of terrorism are rooted in religious ideology. While religion often plays a significant role, it's far from the only motivator. Some terrorist organizations are politically driven, with goals that revolve around changing the social order or gaining independence for a specific region. Take, for example, the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. This organization, active in the late 20th century, used acts of terrorism as a means to an end in their fight for Irish independence from the United Kingdom. Their motivations were political, not religious. In Italy, the Red Brigades emerged, a Marxist-Leninist group that sought to create a revolutionary state through armed struggle. Their acts of violence were driven by their political ideology, not by religious beliefs. Understanding these nuances is crucial in the fight against terrorism. It's not simply a matter of eradicating a singular monolithic enemy. Each terrorist organization has its own motivations, strategies, and tactics, all of which must be understood and countered in unique ways. The history of international terrorism is a complex web of interconnected events, motivations, and actors. It spans many decades, crossing various political, religious, and socio-economic boundaries. This complexity makes the task of countering terrorism a daunting challenge. It's not merely a military or law enforcement issue, but a societal one. It requires a comprehensive approach that addresses not just the symptoms, but the root causes of terrorism. Despite the complexities and challenges, the international community remains committed to this fight. Governments, non-governmental organizations, and individuals around the world are working tirelessly to understand, prevent, and combat acts of terrorism. And so, the fight against terrorism continues, as the world grapples with finding effective solutions to this ever-evolving threat.
That's a wrap for today, folks. If you enjoyed, tap that like button. Don't miss out on the fun. Subscribe to stay tuned. The excitement is just beginning.